Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center event, Sudan at a Crossroads, addressing the largest internal displacement crisis in the world. Chartered by U.S. Congress in 1968, the Wilson Center provides nonpartisan counsel and insights on global affairs to policymakers through deep research, impartial analysis, and independent scholarship. Within this nonpartisan mission, the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative provides evidence-based analysis, translating research into policy impact and practice. This brings us to the event today. Sudan, the third largest country in Africa, is a global humanitarian emergency. Years of protracted crisis led to a full-scale war on April 15, 2023, when fierce fighting broke out between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Almost 15 months into the conflict, Sudan now had the largest internal displacement in the world, with more than 11 million internal displaced persons and at least 2.2 million refugees fleeing to neighboring countries. In addition, Sudan is facing the worst level of acute food insecurity ever recorded by the Integrated Food Security Phase classification in this country, meaning in Sudan. At least half of the more than 47 million population is facing high food scarcity, and others are on the brink of famine, causing one of the prominent Sudanese to warn that, quote, people could die from hunger and starvation more than from bullets, end quote. While Sudan's humanitarian crisis is extremely consequential for the world and the continent of Africa, there has been a lack of global attention. A simple search on large news outlets shows huge disparities in media coverage. For example, as of June 2024, the search term Sudan generated over 18,000 New York Times stories and over 11,000 Washington Post stories. In comparison, the search term Venezuela generated over 37,000 New York Times stories, and over 28,000 Washington Post stories, while Ukraine generated nearly 60,000 New York Times stories and over 280,000 Washington Post stories. So you got the idea. Of the 10 world's most neglected displacement crises reported by the Norwegian Refugee Council, 9 are in Africa, and that includes Sudan as number 10. Why is this crisis not getting much attention? How can we close this gap and raise visibility of the situation facing displaced children and women inside Sudan? What can be done in the short term and long term? And what efforts are in place to address the root causes and bring lasting peace in Sudan? To address this question and more, we are hosting this timely and relevant event. Fighting continues in Sudan as we speak, and people are being displaced. Also, July 18 is the Nelson Mandela International Day, which reminds us of his legacy as a peacemaker, something that the people inside the Sudan don't have now, peace. Therefore, speakers will discuss current efforts to address the displacement crisis, identify existing gaps, and recommend what should be done to raise global awareness and to inspire collective action. So let me leave you with this quote as we go through the event, and this is from Nelson Mandela. Those who live in exile as refugees have long been sustained by the hope for an end to the conflict and the dawning of a better future. I think this fits today, and as we honor Nelson Mandela Day, but as we also reflect on the situation of displaced people in Sudan. I want to thank our partner organization here, Islamic Relief, for partnering with us on this event. So with that, let me introduce the speakers quickly, and then we'll go into the discussion. Let me start with El Sadiq El Noor, who is joining us from Sudan. He's the country director for Islamic Relief Sudan, where he leads the countrywide humanitarian relief program response. He has more than 3 decades of humanitarian experience across Africa and Middle East, including Chad, South Sudan, and Jordan, and more. El Sadiq has worked for international NGOs such as Save the Children. He has a bachelor's degree in public health from the University of Khartoum and MBA in project management from the University of Medical Science and Technology in Sudan. Again, he's going to be joining us from the field to give us the on-the-ground situation. Next, who is also joining us remotely, is Cameron Hudson, who is a senior fellow with the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Cameron served as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, where his research focused on peace, security, and governance issues across Africa. Before that, he served as the executive director of the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. At the State Department, he served as the chief of staff to successive presidential special envoys for Sudan. At the White House during the Bush administration, he was the director of African Affairs at the National Security Council. He started his career as an intelligence analyst in the Africa Directorate at the Central Intelligence Agency. Cameron has a BA from the University of Virginia and master's from Tufts University. And next on the screen is Miyade Kayla, who is an international programs coordinator at Islamic Relief USA, where she focuses on providing international emergency relief and development programming across Eastern Africa, countries including Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, Somalia, and South Sudan. Prior to this, Miede served as a program analyst at the CDC Foundation. Her experience includes a Peace Corps health extension agent managing and implementing PEPFAR and USAID-funded community education projects in Zambia. She has a Master of Public Health from Emory University and a bachelor's degree from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Here inside the studio with us is Bethany Holland, who is an associate director of humanitarian programs at Airlink, leading operation for emergency response and managing key partnerships with commercial airlines and logistic providers. In her role, Bethany has led large-scale responses such as those in Ukraine and Sudan, helping humanitarian organizations overcome logistical challenges to ensure critically needed aid reaches intended population. She has a BA in international studies from Texas A&M and Master of Science in Conflict Analysis and Resolution from George Mason University. Last but not least is Oge Onubogu. She is the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. She brings years of experience as a governance and democracy professional with 2 decades in Africa and covering U.S.-Africa relations. She has partnered with other organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector in covering some elections in Africa. She was previously a director of the West Africa program at the United States Institute of Peace. Prior to that, she was a program manager at the National Democratic Institute and a program officer for West Africa at the National Endowment for Democracy, among other experience. She has a BA from the University of Oklahoma. There you go. And she holds a public leadership credential from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, in addition to master's degrees from Brandeis University. So that is an abbreviated biography for each of the speakers, but you will gain more as they answer this question with the discussion. So let me start with El Sadiq, who is going to join us virtually. And again, we welcome our audience online and in person. I understand there are more than 300 online watching. So thank you for joining us. El Sadiq, as we mentioned, why don't you give us the state of the current humanitarian and displacement situation in the country, and just focus on the key highlight in the next 10 minutes. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. John, and good morning, everyone. It is 4 o'clock, of course, in Sudan. Now, I think the war between Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces entered it is 16 months. Let me just go back to 15 April 2023, when this war erupted in Khartoum. At that time, I was in Khartoum with my family, and every Sudanese in the capital, Khartoum, thought that this conflict will be ended in 72 hours or 7 days or even more, 2 weeks. And then the conflict started to be intensified, and shooting everywhere and artillery shelling everywhere. And then people started to leave their houses and fled to other neighboring states, including myself. I spent around 4 weeks in Khartoum, and then I decided to take my family to the nearest place where I have a sub-office. I can continue the business from there. As Islamic Relief Country Director, it is my responsibility also to respond to the IDPs who fled Khartoum to neighboring states like Jazeera and North Sudan. I went out of Khartoum, and of course, it was not easy for me to go out from Khartoum. I have passed through 7 perilous checkpoints, and honestly, the treatment and violence left a scar in my heart. Finally, I managed to reach Gadarif area. It is 350 kilometers where I have relocated my country office to start the business and respond to those people in Madani, Jazeera, in Sinnar, and in Gadarif. Most of the Khartoum people settle in Madani, which is described as the breadbasket for the country. And the whole Sudan also is the breadbasket for Africa. And at that time, Madani was hosting around 1.7 million. And people started to settle and establish their business. But unfortunately, in December 2023, RSF attacked this area again. This is Madani and Jazeera, the breadbasket of the country. And everything has collapsed, and people again experience secondary displacement. Some of them headed south to Sinnar and Blue Nile, and some of them chose to go east to Gadarif and Sinnar. Islamic Relief was there, and we had an office even in Madani when this war, the second war, affected those population in Jazeera area, and our office was looted and occupied, and all operations were suspended by international NGOs and UN agencies. But still we remain committed in Gadarif to respond to those people in Gadarif, in Sinnar, and Blue Nile, and in Port Sudan by providing cash distribution, shelter, health services, wash, and food bags. The situation now has become more worse as the conflict is escalated. It includes almost 4 states out of 5 states in Darfur and the 3 states of Kordofan, in addition to Khartoum, Jazeera, and Sinnar. Currently, and just 2 weeks back, Sinnar, the capital of Sinnar, Sinja, has been taken by RSA. This is, of course, poses a risk of food insecurity in the coming months, as Jazeera is one of the big irrigation projects where all the stable food like wheat and other will be produced. And Sinnar and Blue Nile, where we have this mechanized farming. And most probably all farmers are going to miss now this agricultural season, which will give us an indicator for the food security in the coming months, and it is an imminent starvation is looming on the horizon. The situation of those people, as John mentioned, the number of these displaced is around 11 million. 2 of them crossed the border to Egypt, other to Chad, and other to South Sudan, and other to Central Africa. Honestly, I can say that most of the IDPs in Sudan, they are not living in camps, in decent camps. Most of them are living in government institutions like schools and other public institutions, and they are lacking clean water, health services, and food. You know that the government financial capacity is very weak, and even international NGOs and UN agencies, despite the effort exerted by them to respond to the actual needs of those people, but the response is far below the actual needs. If I see, for example, that UN agencies requested $2.7 billion for 2023, but they receive only 4% out of this amount. That is why, as we read in all reports, this is a forgotten war. Why international community is not supporting this country? The IDPs in Sudan, honestly, some of them are living with their relatives. This is one of the Sudanese culture, and even giving them hard time, and they are burdened, and even these families who are hosting those IDPs have become very vulnerable, and sometimes it is hard to identify them and register them for any type of assistance. Those who are in Egypt and in Chad, also they are suffering a lot. Those in Chad, they are not in very distant in the rainy season. They are exposed to rainy season and exposed to direct sunlight. Those who are in Egypt, they are suffering from the legal documentation. Most of them, they went to like visa. Takes almost 5 months to have a visa, and people will not wait. People are just fleeing the conflict in all areas of Sudan. The Khartoum as a capital now has become a ghost. I can say that it has become a ghost city. And this is the place where we have all economic institutions, we have all the education institutions, we have the history of Sudan in this country, and all this has been collapsed and completely destroyed. Jazeera area has been completely destroyed as a second area in Sudan. And it's still, the conflict is going on and intensified. If you look at all the IBC just produced like 1 month and a half back, around 8.5 million at IBC4. This is an emergency level, and 755 at IBC5, which is catastrophic. And more people are starving. If people in Darfur, for example, also they are going to miss this agricultural season, and they are bounded by their circumstances. Some of them are living in camps, and even the cross-border operations from Chad, the government rejects the routes of Adri from Chad through Adri to Jenaina, and they determine another route to Atina. This is in North Darfur. and this will complicate also the situation. And there are no supplies, there are no food in Darfur itself. So people, they need to agree quickly on the safe routes and the cross-border operation to bring all those food to the people in Darfur. Although Islamic Relief is present on the ground in central Darfur, receiving general food distribution from WFP, and we distributed to 120,000 IDPs in the camps of Zalingi. This is in central Darfur. I can say that there are many challenges to deliver the assistance. There is inaccessibility. If I have any supplies from the north, I cannot reach the remote areas in Kordofan and Darfur. There is no guarantee that food will not be looted or diverted. Also, there is communication blackout, and this impacted also the delivery of all these issues in Sudan, and the absence of banking services. If we take, for example, the whole Darfur, there is not even a single bank, and this is one of the problems: how to implement project there, how to transfer money to suppliers, and all these are affected even by this blackout of communication and absence of banking system in this area. There is inflation rate also every day is increasing. If we just talk about today, the $1 equal 2,400 in the street prices, while in the bank is 1,800, and this is just recently increased. This is always give us hard time, and the suppliers always decline and made the procurement for the humanitarian assistance items very difficult. There are some bureaucratic impediments and restrictions here and there, and people will manage to do it, but also it will delay the humanitarian aid in this area. So the economic problem, the insecurity in that area, communication blackout, all these are the key drivers of the situation in Sudan. Now I can say that without coming together and joining effort, all stakeholders come together, stop the war, and join the effort to provide at least safe routes for the people at the first stage to reach all those people in remote areas, and at the same time to establish resilient and recovery project for those people to go back to their homes. If you ask any Sudanese elsewhere, what do you want? He will just say that I want to go home. This has become for us, everyone, even me. I'm IDPs. I can say that I'm IDP working for IDPs. I left my house is occupied. But that is the situation in the whole Sudan. Most of the Sudanese, either IDPs or refugees, they are looking for peace. They want to go back to their home. Around 90 million children are out of school now, and we don't know their fate because most of the schools are occupied by IDPs, and the government is unable to establish any, even including other NGOs, establish decent camps to relocate these IDPs. That is all from my side, and I will just give the floor. If any question to me, I can answer this. But I can say also this, okay? This will spill. I can just say that this war of Sudan may spill into other neighboring countries. You know that there are like 5 countries: Central Africa, South Sudan, Chad, Eritrea, Egypt, and Libya, and all negotiation of peace with no positive result for Sudanese, and we don't have any hope that they will come with any positive result for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al Sadiq, and this was very informative on the ground facts that you are providing. And now I will stay on the screen by bringing in Miada, who you may have seen in CNN. He was trapped inside the Sudan when the war broke out in April, and she was visiting from USA, visiting the relative. Just a few weeks after arrival, the war broke out. So I am going to start from that, Miade. What was it like to experience this, and how has your life experience informed your current humanitarian work? You came back and you are doing this humanitarian leave, thinking about those people. So what was it like? Maybe briefly, about 3 minutes, as you answered that question. How is your organization addressing the situation that El Sadiq just described in the context of what you have seen when you were there? So welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, I went back home to visit. It was about in March of 2023. Just go spend Ramadan and Eid with my family and my friends. And then shortly after, hearing whispers of a potential conflict, began to kind of circulate. But we kind of just thought it was just kind of talk, and there was nothing to really worry about. But then soon after, started seeing military vehicles around Khartoum. And then after that, on April 15th of 2023, those whispers got to turn into reality as, fighting officially broke out. So I was actually really thankful I was able to kind of flee very early on, kind of immediately. And where I went to Kosti, which is in White Nile State of Sudan. This is where a good portion of my family resides. And there I waited, just kind of hoping the conflict would end soon. So I could, return back to Khartoum and come back to the US. The airport was destroyed. It kind of became very clear to me that leaving the country was not going to be as straightforward anymore. And so weeks after weeks, just as also Al Sadiq mentioned, we thought it was, it wasn't going to, take pretty long for it to end. But after week, the violence kind of persisted, and it became very evident that, there was really no end in sight. I didn't really initially start panicking until I realized that there was really no formed, evacuation plan for, the 16,000 US citizens that were in the country at the time. And in that moment, I felt very ignored and very much abandoned, and I think I could speak is all of my other Sudanese Americans as well. We kind of felt very similar. And so it took quite some time, but after, just kind of waiting it out, my uncle and I were able to kind of formulate a plan to evacuate ourselves. And it took about, I think, a week and a half just to leave Sudan, in which we stayed, in different cities throughout Sudan and kind of just traveling throughout, and we finally made it into Ethiopia. And then from there, we were able to come back. So I think, to just kind of wrap that up, I just want to say that we were really fortunate to even be able to afford our evacuation, bearing the steep cost of transportation, accommodation, and, necessities, during the crisis. It was just really, really, really expensive at that time. And in contrast to many in Sudan, face these hardships and during long journeys, and were able to afford this. And so I do carry that guilt inside of me. My safety contrasts starkly with the ongoing struggles of my family and the countless others that, are still displaced currently, internally and externally, and that are seeking safety across borders. To kind of go back in the work that I'm doing with Islamic Relief, a quick background, Islamic Relief has been serving Sudan since 1984, providing both emergency aid and long-term development assistance. This, I think, has a longstanding presence, really highlights our commitment to the people of Sudan. In April of 2023, we did launch an emergency response in Sudan to support those affected by the widespread violence. And this response focuses on providing essential services such as food, water, healthcare, and shelter. Our work areas currently are in Gadaref, Blue Nile, West Kordofan, North Kordofan, Port Sudan, and parts of Central Darfur. So these areas still remain functional, although the implementation of our programs have, slowed down, obviously due to, security concerns in some areas, such as, the conflict surrounding the Blue Nile, with the recent conflict that just started in Sinjar Sinnar. Our key staff, as you know, including Al Sadiq, the country director, have relocated to Port Sudan and Gadaref field offices after the closure of our country office in Khartoum due to the ongoing fighting and insecurity. So despite these challenges, at Islamic Relief, we're really working tirelessly to support the people of Sudan through various relief efforts. We are providing food and water, to ensure basic needs are met, delivering healthcare services to address the medical needs of those affected by the conflict, and offering a shelter to, protect, vulnerable populations from harsh conditions. In addition to our efforts within Sudan, we are also supporting Sudanese refugees in neighboring countries like Chad and Egypt by providing this similar things that, such as food, water, healthcare services, and shelter as well. And so my lived experience in Sudan, deeply informs my work. Understanding the struggles and resilience of the people really, helps me advocate more effectively and tailor our relief efforts to their needs. And this connection is what really fuels my commitment in ensuring that our work is not just about providing aid, but also about standing in solidarity with my people, the Sudanese people.
Thank you very much. And that was powerful, the lived experience, but also your professional expertise in doing this. Now we have heard from the ground and the lived experience. I'm going to come to you, Cameron. You serve as Chief of Staff to Special Envoys in various capacities at the State Department, the White House, the CIA. In your recent commentary, you argue that, and I quote, Washington is becoming irrelevant in Sudan. So now with all this situation, explain what to our audience, what do you mean by your argument? As a way of setting the tone or opening, and then I will ask you, of course, later on follow-up questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I caught a cold and I'm losing my voice, so I apologize. What I meant by that, and I was intentionally being provocative, but really, if you look back at the last 20 years of U.S. involvement in Sudan, we've had 9 special envoys to Sudan. The president, the secretary of state, we've had high levels of involvement that the Sudanese people have seen. We don't have that level today. And we don't have that level of interest in Sudan today. We don't have that prioritization of Sudan today in our national security decision-making apparatus. And we can argue that that's because of Gaza or Ukraine or other world events. But I remind people that when the Darfur War broke out, or when we were negotiating the comprehensive peace agreement, helping the parties to negotiate that, we were also, it was in the months after 9/11 in the United States. We were in a war on terror in Afghanistan. We had invaded Iraq. Not that those are proud moments in U.S. history, but I say that because those were events that required the entire national security apparatus of the United States to be focused on the deployment of U.S. forces and the safety of U.S. forces. We don't even have that today, and we're saying that we can't focus on Sudan, when at that time we could focus on Iraq, Afghanistan, other world events, and have a direct focus on Sudan. So I think we're at a low point in American history in terms of our engagement on this conflict. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think, speaking as someone who was in the Bush administration when we were responding to these efforts, we were closer to the effects of the Rwandan genocide. And I think people were keenly aware of the moral stain that left on the Clinton administration for not responding to genocide. It was not long after the Srebrenica genocide. We had intervened in Kosovo just a few years before. So all of these things were very much present on the minds of U.S. officials in a way that I think that they're just not today. I think that the Biden administration does not worry about its legacy in a place like Sudan. It's much more worried about, what I would call first order national security concerns, great power competition, these kinds of things. And so the world has changed. U.S. Leverage in the world has changed. We are a different country than we were 15 or 20 years ago. I think we have overlearned some of the lessons of the past decade. I think specifically about a case like Libya, where then Vice President Biden was very much opposed to the NATO intervention in Libya. We've obviously seen the effects of that intervention play out across the Sahel over more than a decade of instability and violence and terrorism. And so I think that there's a cautiousness from US officials today about how we approach conflicts in the world, not just in Africa, but in the world, that are not part of a very small group of, first order national security concerns that affect the homeland, that directly affect the US economy and US interests in the world. And I think sadly, Sudan does not rise to that level, but I think lots of other countries and conflicts also don't rise to that level. So I think those are some of the differences that we face today in trying to rally more attention, more activity from the U.S. administration. We have a special envoy today, which is a good step, but he doesn't have a team. He doesn't have high-level interventions to assist him, and he doesn't have that public outcry that we had 20 years ago as well. And so, without those ingredients, I'm pretty pessimistic about what role Washington can play, and if it can recreate the role that it played 10 years ago, 20 years ago in trying to bring peace to Sudan. I'm very skeptical of that right now.
Thank you. And public outcry, raising this to the visibility of policy, and it's one of the reasons why we have this, so that we can get a lot of insights into informing policy. Now, Oge, I'm going to come to you. Cameron mentioned the other issues, such as in the Sahel. You cover Africa. How are the ongoing issues in the continent, in the Sahel, in North and East Africa, affect the Sudan crisis and vice versa?
Thank you very much, Johnson. And can you all hear me? So first of all, I want to thank you, for hosting this timely conversation. I think any opportunity that we have to ensure that we put the spotlight on what we see happening in Sudan is important. And I really want to, hats off to colleagues from the Islamic Relief Fund, those who are working on the ground every single day to see a resolution to the issues in Sudan. One thing I do want to mention, too, as well about our work here at the Wilson Center in the Africa program is that we do have a Sudan's working group that has been working on issues on the Sudan since 2009. This is a working group that is, co-chaired today by the former Sudanese ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Nuruddin Sati, and our former U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan, Ambassador Donald Booth. And since January of this year, we've been convening a series of conversations to really ensure that civilian voices, Sudanese civilian voices, are informing the discussions that are happening here in Washington, D.C., to address the crisis in Sudan, basically to end the war in Sudan. And I think for me, this is key to the point and the question that you posed, John Ton, about, thinking about all the other conflicts and crises that we see on the continent, is the place of civilian voices, where citizens are given that space. People who are really impacted every day by these issues are given that space to express their concerns and inform U.S. policy or actions towards addressing the crisis. When we talk about the issues in the Sahel and we look at the coups that have happened across the Sahel, very often we talk about these issues. When we say Sahel, we think West Africa. We think about the countries in the Sahelian region in West Africa. But geographically, when we look at the map, Sahel extends all the way from Western Africa to the Horn of Africa, which also includes Sudan. A lot of the fighters that we see within the RSF, if we think about their cultural backgrounds too as well, a lot of their cultural backgrounds are also linked to groups in the Sahel. So we're facing a situation where in the case of Sudan, we see two twin threats here. one with a humanitarian crisis on one side, and then also looking at an imminent threat of state collapse. If we see a state collapse in the case of Sudan, where do we think these RSF fighters and the others are going to flee to? So we're basically looking at a thread of instability across the Sahel region. So I think it's very important for us when we talk about the crisis in Sudan, when we talk about the issues, that we look at it within the broader context of the region. And I think this is where we have to stretch our thinking. This is where we have to, we've been so, I think going back to the point about being cautious about where we engage, we've been thinking in silos for too long. And I think it's important for us when we think about this crisis to look at the regional impacts of it. Apart from that, in the case of Sudan too as well, you spoke, John Ton, at the top during your introduction, when you looked at, just the population size and the sheer size of the country. Sudan is really surrounded by, you have Chad, you have Egypt, you have Ethiopia, you have several countries across the board. And this itself creates a challenge. So a state of state collapse or a situation of state collapse in Sudan would have significant impacts. So I think for me, going back to the question on, when we look at the broader issues, or the broader context, when we think about what we see happening in the Sahel, in West Africa, in East Africa, it's important that we look at this issue. We have these conversations within the context of their broader implications. And even when we talk about internally displaced people in Sudan, let's also remember that before the conflict, this conflict broke out April 15th of last year, that there were other people from neighboring countries too as well that were also seeking refuge in Sudan. So now with a conflict, you have people that are now twice displaced in the country. And that's also another story that hasn't yet been told, or isn't being told effectively. So I'm going to stop there, and other comments I can add on later.
Thank you. And building on the twin threads, and as mentioned earlier by El Sadiq and Miada, Bethany, coming to you, your organization does logistics operation in challenging environment, and you have led these large-scale responses to Ukraine, to Sudan. So help us understand the context here in terms of the biggest challenges in delivering and administering aid as far as what your organization does is concerned. And maybe you compare how these operations and responses, Sudan, Ukraine, and others, to help our audience understand what you do.
Thank you. And thank you as well for putting this panel together. We're honored to be a part of it. A brief background on Airlink. So Airlink supports our network of over 200 vetted nonprofits to scale up humanitarian response by securing free of charge or heavily discounted airlift and identifying logistic solutions in these challenging settings. This in turn allows our partners to redirect their resources towards purchasing humanitarian supplies, hiring more staff, maintaining their programs in countries where there are responses. So as John Ton did mention, Airlink has been active in both Ukraine and Sudan, and they are completely different response operations for several reasons. One similarity is that airspace restrictions have required alternative solutions of aid movement into the country. So less capacity to directly airlift goods into the country, although in Sudan, there is, a little bit of availability there, which I'll get to in a minute. But in comparison to Ukraine, we've seen less funding, less donor interest, less interest from the public for humanitarian response in Sudan. I'm sure we all remember, very soon after the Ukraine conflict began, the world came together and we were talking about it, we were fundraising, and there was a lot of action following the onset of that in March 2022. But we haven't seen that yet for Sudan, and it's part of the reason why we are here having this conversation. I think it is really important to continue to highlight the significant challenges that we see in delivering aid both to Sudan and throughout the country as well. This was already touched on a little bit, but just to add to these challenges is critical gaps in road transportation is driven by security impediments, restricting safe humanitarian access, whether that is a shift in fighting or a shift in the entity that might control a certain area. These sorts of impediments are cutting off one of very few potential routes in reaching intended populations. And then on top of this is seasonal weather. So with heavy rains, for example, this might cut off an alternative route and completely remove that option in moving aid via land transport to populations that are in need. And I think with Sudan, the complete cut off of cities and urban areas and just the sheer number of people that are in need of humanitarian aid within these areas that have no access to it is unfortunately unique as well. And again, this was also touched on a bit, but the bureaucratic requirements for NGOs to even just travel within the country to communities and distribute this necessary aid. These include coordinating with agencies to negotiate and secure safe access. This can change drastically depending on the entity that is controlling a certain area. So you might know the process very well for one specific area, but as control shifts as well, this adds an additional challenge to NGOs trying to respond. And just lastly, this is all, of course, depends on aid arriving in Sudan to then be transported by trucks from Port Sudan to intended populations in the country. Like I said, with airspace restrictions, there is limited airlift options, and these all carry a significant expense for NGO partners. Just to, I guess, paint that picture very quickly, is from Nairobi to Port Sudan, there's a reliance on charters, or there's a reliance on available freighter capacity that is irregularly scheduled. The charter is well over $100,000, and this space on a freighter might be about $9 US per kilogram. This is in comparison to, let's say, $2 to $3 per kilogram to move cargo from the United States into Europe. So there are these huge cost constraints that are limiting NGOs from being able to easily and quickly move cargo into the country, especially when they are also, needing budget items for procuring the goods, for paying their staff, for additional costs of running a response. So I will leave it at that, but happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you both, El Sadiq and Miada, in terms of delivering aid. You have organizations like Herling, as just described, doing the logistic part. But you have that domestic humanitarian relief agency, Islamic Relief, operating inside the country. Is aid reaching the intended population? And what other relief organization alongside your organization that are there in the field doing this? And some of the challenges outlined earlier are there. But if you could speak to that, accessibility of aid, reaching the intended population. So let me start with you, Miada, and then I will go back to El Sadiq, and then we'll circle back. Just you can limit your response to 1 to 2.
Yeah, I think in terms of thank you, of aid, I think we've seen, most of the aid they're getting locally, securing locally. But I think the issue really is in certain areas in the Darfur region, specifically where it's very limited, where there is no aid coming. And I'm actually just going to be very short and brief because Al Sadiq actually knows much more on this in terms of answering this question, in terms of he's working on the ground and seeing where aid is being delivered and in which parts of Sudan. So I'm just going to pass that back to Al Sadiq if we can touch base on that a little bit more.
Excellent. Al Sadiq, that's is aid reaching the intended population, and what about those that are not receiving aid? How are they going about? You are muted.
Thank you very much. In the areas controlled by SAF, from Port Sudan to Gadarif to Sinnar to Blue Nile and the North Sudan, there is no problem. We transport all the items and supplies from here to the intended population in this area. And Islamic Relief use even to buy items and all supplies locally and to use trucks to send it to the intended population or beneficiaries. The main challenge is Kordofan and Darfur. In Darfur, you cannot send any supplies from here. Even UN agencies, their trucks are stranded in Kosti, Mayada knows this place, and they're unable to send it to Darfur. That is why we are talking about the cross-border operations from Chad. And Islamic Relief is present in Central Darfur, as I mentioned before, and we receive many trucks from WFP. This is partnership with WFP, and we distributed the general food distribution to IDPs in the camps. And also we have received some nutrition supplies because we are managing around 10 health facilities in Central Darfur in terms of nutrition and medicine. And we were able to buy medicine from within Darfur in coordination and advice from the MSF and all those people who are on the ground. Sending supplies from North Sudan to Kordofan and Darfur is very challenging. As I said, it is one of the challenges for Darfur now and Kordofan. Those states, if this problem is not solved, they are going to face a catastrophic in the coming months. Again, now we have a new area because even this Sinnar and Sinjar. The only safe routes from North Sudan through Kassala, through Gadarif, and then through Sinjar, through the White Nile and Blue Nile is Sinjar place. And now Sinjar is blocked and has already has fallen under the control of RSF. Even Blue Nile now is blocked. We will not receive any inputs. Our people there, they have already developed their evacuation plan to South Sudan, and they have a Starlink somewhere. They just call us once a day, what is going on, and they are ready even to move if anything happens, because they are expecting that. People in Sinnar and Sinjar, they are suffering a lot, because from Madani, they cannot receive anything. RSF is controlling the Madani, controlling Sinjar from the south, and from the east, from Gadarif, no one can enter this area. Those people also are encirculated by those RSF in this area, including Jazeera. In Khartoum, of course, no one, because there are no safe routes to this area. No one can go to Khartoum and can provide any type of service, including all international NGOs and even UN agencies. It is difficult to go to Khartoum and Khartoum Bahari. In Omdurman, people started to have like voluntary return coming from other part of Sudan or Egypt. But movement is a problem. Still, there are some artillery shelling from elsewhere. Many people have been killed by this artillery shelling. So the situation, if I talk about insecurity and inaccessibility, this is honestly, this is one of the main challenges to transport any supplies to the needy people in remote areas such as Darfur and Kordofan. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we're moving to what should be done. So I am coming back to you, Oge. So before we move to the international community, let's stay within the African continent. What is the African Union doing and the other regional bodies about the situation in Sudan?
Thank you so much for that question. So I think when we look at the current crisis in Sudan today, what we're basically seeing is a breakdown of the political economic relationship that has basically sort of hobbled the state together for several years. Now let's go back to history of Sudan. Even right from independence, we've seen a series of conflicts. This is a country where we've seen 17 attempted coups over time. 7 of these attempted coups have been successful. We've seen 4 civil wars since independence. We've seen various levels of crisis. So it's one that has a very, very complicated and complex history when it comes to political power, the role of the military, the state security, and how it's intertwined in the economic structure of the state. So what we're seeing currently now is just, as I mentioned, a breakdown of this political economic relationship where the center for so long has fed off the groups on the outside, the periphery groups. And you have, now this war is really a fight between 2 men, 2 individuals. So sometimes when we say a civil war, we ask ourselves, who is at the center of this crisis? You have the SAF on one side with Burhan and the RSF. And these are 2 generals who basically believe that they can win the war. So there is no innocent party here at the end of the day. And I think it's important that we put this into perspective when we think about the role that the African Union or IGAD, the regional body, can play. Now, over time, since this crisis broke out on April 15th of 2023, there have been several conversations, several discussions pushing for a peace, to push for a peace process. There's been very little success, to be honest. Very, very, very little progress has been made. And I think it also stems from that level of distrust as well, that some of the warring parties, the warring parties on both sides could also have of the continental body, the AU and the IGAD. And I think it's important in conversations like this to be honest, and where we've seen lapses in the AU's approach in trying to address or actually hold push for a ceasefire. So there is distrust, basically, with the warring parties and how they can trust the AU to address the crisis. Now, I think even the AU itself and IGAD itself internally, I think there's been a lot of soul searching and thinking to realize that there needs to be a different approach, that the crisis needs to end. So in this year, I believe it was a few months ago, the AU has actually set up a high-level panel. So this is a high-level panel that is led by Ambassador Ibn Chambers, for many who followed the crisis in Darfur, he also played a pretty critical role at that point too as well. So the high-level panel is really, these are very, very early days. I think they've only held 1 or 2 meetings thus far. So there are conversations that are being had. Now, if we put it in context with the conflict, it is, we have to be realistic about what could be achievable by this body. But I think this is a step in the right direction. And most importantly, as the AU engages, it must find ways to ensure that civilian voices are part of the conversation. Now, you will hear concerns about the disagreements that we see within civilian actors, but that in itself should not be an excuse to think about ways that we can engage civilian voices in the conversations in trying to push for a peace process. So back to your question on the efforts that we've seen within the AU and IGAD, We haven't seen a lot of progress since these conversations started, since the beginning of the war. There are efforts now with the creation of the high-level panel and a lot of searching, so inside searching that has been done to try to find ways to move forward. And, you know, I just want to remember that when this war broke out on April 15th, I was actually on a plane on my way to Nairobi. And right there on the plane, there were, you know, we knew that there was something wrong because at that point, flights were getting delayed and things were, flights were getting delayed and being diverted in different directions. And when I landed in Nairobi, you could see that a lot of the conversation that was happening there in those first few hours as the war broke out was all about everyone trying to see what could be done. It didn't come as a surprise to many individuals that this crisis broke out. It didn't come as a surprise. And I think this is where, going back to that first question, really thinking about how the AU itself, how we strengthen, how the African Union strengthens preventative mechanisms, because this war didn't come as a surprise to many. So.
Thank you. And Cameron, I am going to bring you in here, having heard the perspective that the African Union is slow or the progress in the IGAD. And we know wars have come and gone in Sudan. The first civil war of 1956 through the Addis Ababa Agreement in 72. Then the second civil war, which I am a survivor of, 1983 to 2005. And now we have this current, there were others, the coups, as Oge mentioned. What have we not learned from history? And what are your thoughts on why this is not getting attention? Are we immune to that kind of wars globally and with the perspective of the U.S. government as well?
Sure, thank you. You know, I want to say that this war is unlike any other war that Sudan has experienced, right? I think we have to remind ourselves of that. It started in the capital, and it grew out of the capital across the country. Unlike the war in the south, or unlike the war in Darfur, which was the capital bringing violence to peripheral areas. This has been the peripheral areas, in some respect, with the RSF bringing violence to the capital. And so the very nature of this fight is unlike anything that Sudan has experienced in its post-independence history. And I think we have to remember that, because we have been ill-equipped to respond to this kind of violence. We have been ill-equipped to respond to violence in the capital, where the airport is shut off, and where the main transport routes in the country have been cut off. And that has affected the humanitarian situation. It's obviously affected the security and the displacement situation in the country. So it really is, I think, very unique. We have also, you know, as I said before, you know, all of these institutions, whether it's the United States, the United Nations, the African Union, IGAD, they're in radically different places than they were in 20 years ago. The UN Security Council, which, you know, at the time in the CPA and in Darfur, the first Darfur conflict, was very actively involved. There were dozens of UN Security Council resolutions. You know, the international community was working together to solve the crisis in Sudan. And that has stopped. That no longer happens. There have been essentially 2 UN Security Council conversations with very weak outcomes in the 15 or 16 months since the war started. So the international system is not responding in the way that it did previously. Similarly, the AU and IGAD are not responding in the way that it did previously. I remind people all the time that when the war in Darfur started, it was the AU that sent in peacekeepers and peace monitors first. They sent in 150 Rwandan forces, 150 Nigerian forces. the Africans led in the response in both the North-South and in Darfur. The United States, the EU, the UN were able to come in and supplement. They were able to support. They acted largely in that support capacity. Washington today is not equipped to lead. It's not being listened to when it tries to lead. And I think the real difference is that we don't see the AU leading like they led previously. The AU led and Washington followed. And we're not experiencing that right now for a whole host of reasons. And frankly, we saw a lot of that even in the Ethiopia Tigray conflict recently, where I think the AU has either abandoned its principles or it's not living up to all of its principles from a variety of bureaucratic or leadership reasons. And so I don't know exactly what the answer is and how we can lead, but we've also seen now in a way that we didn't see 20 years ago, the role of regional actors and what we call middle power actors playing a much more dominant role. And whether that's Egypt or Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Turkey or Iran or Russia, there's a host of countries who are playing a role in Sudan on both sides of the conflict that are helping to extend, prolong, and worsen that conflict. And so 20 years ago, where Washington could have leverage on a weak state like Sudan, a relatively weak state, it doesn't have that same kind of leverage over Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia. It can try to push and cajole and pressure them, but ultimately the United States, or EU, or anyone else can't force, and has shown that it can't force the UAE to suspend its support to the RSF, or it's not willing to do that because that comes at too great a cost to other Washington interests that we have in the UAE, like rebuilding Gaza or sending peacekeepers to Gaza, or whatever it is, or the price of global oil in the lead up to a presidential election. So there are trade-offs that Washington is not willing to make in Turkey, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in UAE. And that's very different today than it was 20 years ago. Those countries were not a factor in the war in Darfur. They were not a factor in the North-South Civil War, like they are a factor today in determining the outcome of the conflict in Sudan. And so the geopolitics of this moment are so different than those previous moments. I struggle to tell you what is the lesson that we can apply. I think the one thing that I would say in terms of a lesson that we've gotten wrong is the lesson of accountability. We talked a lot during the Darfur conflict about accountability and holding people accountable. And there was an ICC investigation that was opened. There were indictments that were handed down by the ICC. They've gone nowhere. They haven't been pursued, from the president down to field level commanders in the Janjaweed. So the message from the international community was never sent to the perpetrators of the violence in Sudan, that if you commit these kinds of horrendous crimes, the crime of genocide, that you will be held accountable. We can say that, but unless we make it so, then that lesson is not learned. And we are seeing the same groups commit the same crimes against the same civilian populations today as we did 20 years ago. And, that's on the international community. That is on the failure to apply the law, apply the threats that we imposed, the threat of accountability, and the threat, and that's not just a threat of accountability, it's the lesson of accountability. And there's a belief in the international justice system that by bringing justice, you can ward off future crimes. And we have clearly not applied that in the case of Sudan, and we are seeing those crimes reemerge. And someone said earlier, that people are being displaced for the second time in this conflict. Well, I would remind us all that they're probably being displaced, in Darfur at least, for the third or the fourth time in 20 years, right? And so unless we can apply those lessons really, and we can pursue justice really in a place like Sudan, I'm very fearful of future episodes of violence occurring.
Thank you, and that's a history repeating itself. In the case in point, Darfur genocide. I was a congressional intern when the Darfur genocide was declared during the Bush administration, and Congress passed that resolution, but that was non-binding, and so the perpetrators would just drag their feet if there's no muscle attached to. And that is repeating itself now. We have congressional action again, talking about the genocide situation. And now it's with the Africa program, your point that African Union should lead and others will follow. And I think that's also a message to the African Union, IGAD, in the region. So let me, before I go back to the two of you, El Sadiq and Miada, let me come to you, Bethany. What should or is the role of a private sector in this, where government are not effective, but we are talking about the displaced people here suffering, and the solution is not coming anytime soon. Solution being stopping the war. Is there a role that the private sector is playing or can play in this?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So Airlink is in a unique position where we are regularly engaging partners across multiple sectors in order to launch and maintain a response. This is no different for our response within Sudan. But from this position at this nexus of the humanitarian community and the private sector, we witness daily the aviation community as an example.
Can you?
Where was I? Oh, so we witness daily the aviation community's willingness to use its resources as a force for good. But to raise more awareness about Sudan, we need both sectors to collaborate more closely and to foster successful private-public partnerships. For Sudan and the role of private sector aviation, private sector donors, there is, obviously, as we have all been communicating, an intense need to increase the message and to increase the understanding with our private sector partners and to push for that all hands on deck approach, leveraging resources that Airlink has within our networks, their resources, their expertise, and these sorts of partnerships make our response possible. And I think the best way to show this is with a quick example about a recent shipment that we supported with one of our NGO partners to Blue Nile. And this stocked health facilities that were critically undersupplied. And now these facilities have some of the only stocks of certain medicines within the state. And our NGO partners actually shared that not only did this shipment deliver critically needed aid, but it also delivered hope to the communities that were receiving these goods. They were hopeful because there were trucks delivering aid to their very small town, that the effort was being made to make sure that they were receiving what are primary care medications, but they were not stocked with those primary care medications for a significant amount of time. And this is all very timely with the increase of fighting in Sinar and the displacement into Blue Nile as well. But this sort of coordination is not possible without the network and expertise of in-country logistics partners, with in-country staff, with our NGO partners, international staff, commercial aviation, freight forwarders, transport companies, customs brokers, coordinating bodies such as the Global Logistics Cluster within the World Food Program, with Sudan's INGO Forum that is bringing together local and regional NGOs to make sure that there is a locally led response. But all of these bodies and all of these partners coming together is what makes this, something that seems impossible possible. So I think being creative in how we engage our private sector partners, making sure that there isn't this almost fear or misunderstanding of the potential politicalization of aid. That is a huge challenge when there maybe are sensitivities because a situation due to geopolitics does seem too political, but when it comes down to it, the humanitarian aid is needed.
Well, thank you. We have we have approximately 13 minutes left. So here is how the time will go. I'm going to throw this question to El Sadiq and Miade, and then I will come back with the final round where you can give us your key takeaway as a way forward. So think while I'm asking this question. How are the Sudanese responding in terms of what should be done? What are you hearing from the ground, El Sadiq? What are you hearing from the diaspora, Mieda? What should be done, and maybe how it should be done? So what should be done? So obvious, stop the war, as you mentioned earlier, bring peace. But we have heard how difficult it is to bring peace. So what else? So let me start with you, El Sadiq. Just one minute, if you could limit it. What are the IDPs saying about what need to happen?
Thank you very much. If you ask me about the role of Sudanese just to bring an end to this war, I'm not a politician, but honestly, I didn't see any significant role of Sudanese, especially the political parties. We know big parties just to end this war. They should play more role to stop this war and let these people who are suffering go back to their homes. People should now, it is enough, 16 months, everyone is hurted, everyone is affected by this war. I think it is time to come together and try to bring peace to this country. Our country has been destroyed, but at the same time, I want to ask all this, like African Union, like IGAD, to play a role. I didn't see any role. Sorry to say that. As soon as the COP happened in Sudan, they immediately just suspended the membership of Sudan, even they didn't give people to negotiate that. Even in terms of humanitarian assistance, I didn't see any African country provided any assistance to these affected people in Sudan. On the contrary, the cars and equipments loaded from Sudan are all now are just sold in these neighboring countries, which is unfortunate. And as I said, this war also will spell to the other neighboring country, and they may experience the same. For Sudanese, I think it is high time. If the regional system, the regional organization are not doing well, let them come together. All those politicians, all those people with different ethnic group, with different parties, they should come together. Otherwise, the whole country will collapse. Instead of just talking about ruling this country, we will not have a country in a near future. And as you said, how this war has Ogi, I think Ogi, I want to say there should be a real definition to this war. Unless there is a real definition of this war, the solution will not come. If you don't know the root causes of this war, you will not bring the solution for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Miade, as mentioned earlier, the voice of the Sudanese civilian, and that include the diaspora, people like yourself and others. And our research found that, policymakers whether in the U.S. or elsewhere, at least pay attention to when there are 4 conditions. One is if the crisis that is happening elsewhere has a link to foreign policy objective domestically. And 2, if there are visible and clear humanitarian needs, which in this case we have. And then 3, if there is a strong domestic constituency bringing the issue to visibility, and that includes the diaspora. That's the situation we had with the Ukraine. And then finally is, of course, if there's a congressional backing of the presidential action. So I'm bringing this because you are one voice of the diaspora. What are you hearing from people like yourself about what should be done?
Yeah, I think within the Sudanese diaspora, we've discussed, a number of key steps. I think there's several that we need to take. First and foremost, as Al-Sadiq mentioned, that, I think we all agreed that we need a complete ceasefire, right, between the forces in Sudan. But not just that, but it's crucial to, include actual peace building, process, that's actually deeply inclusive, and recognizing the vast diversity of Sudan's civilian voices. Those working towards peace, must reach out to a broader range of actors to ensure that, everyone's perspectives are considered. And I think as we see from time to time through history, that wasn't always the case. I think we need to move in that direction. Additionally, I think we need all foreign states, to stop funding and arming the warring parties in Sudan, as Cameron mentioned. I think this external support very much fuels the conflict and prolongs the suffering of civilians. Additionally, I think that we must ensure, unrestricted humanitarian access, to all areas of Sudan. Aid organizations need to be able to reach those in need without any obstacles. The international community, plays a role as well. We really need to step up. I think it needs to step up its financial contributions to humanitarian aid. Right now, there's a dire need for food and other essentials in Sudan. And as Al-Sadiq mentioned earlier, the international community pledged roughly $2.7 billion. Sudan only received about 4% of that. And this gap needs to be closed urgently. Since I think returning or remaining in Sudan has become, no longer an option, we need to create, safe and legal routes for Sudanese refugees to be able to immigrate abroad or to nearby countries. People are really fleeing unimaginable horrors, and I think that they all deserve a chance to be able to rebuild their lives in safety. And then lastly, my final point, I think Cameron mentioned this as well. We must hold all those responsible, right, for crimes against humanity, including those committed during the previous genocides, such as like Darfur, Nuba Mountains, and Blue Nile State. I think that justice is really essential if we're going to be able to heal and, rebuild trust in Sudan. And that's my final point.
Well, thank you. Now, the final round is I'm going to ask everybody, and I will start here with Bethany. What is your key takeaway for the audience? And that should be less than 1 minute. And because we are doing this on Mandela International Day, you can add a positive thing after your key takeaway. What does this mean, the Mandela Day here in connection to this event? So Bethany, what is your key takeaway? You can repeat what you said before or what you have reserved for this time. So.
To repeat a little bit of what I have said and what my fellow panelists have said as well, key takeaways are just our action items of how we can increase access to aid in Sudan. This was just mentioned, but securing reliable, safe access for humanitarian organizations. This is additional funding for the procurement of aid for programs in country for all levels of the response. And this is also just ensuring that we are coming together and that the humanitarian sector is not standing in our own way. There are, I'm trying to think of the right word. A very disheartening amount of needs within Sudan right now. And if we continue to stand in our own way, then we are unable to respond. And I think I'll keep it as simple as that. But with this event on Nelson Mandela Day, there is always hope. And I think a panel like this shows that, and bringing together organizations from across the board, it shows that there is hope and that there are a lot of people that care very deeply about finding a solution.
Well, thank you. Okay, your key takeaway.
Thank you very much, Johnson, and several key takeaways for me from this, but I'm going to keep it short. I think just in hearing the conversation and following the situation over the last couple of months is that whatever emerges after the civil war, when this war eventually ends, will not be the same Sudan. And I think that is something very, very important that we have to keep in mind, that the conversations that we have today, the voices we involve today, will really help thinking about how those voices help to shape and inform what a new Sudan could look like. And even when we talk about peace processes, I think just going back to the fact that we've seen so many failed ceasefire attempts or ceasefire attempts with very, very little progress, we shouldn't lose faith. Because with every failed attempt provides an opportunity for us to think differently, provides an opportunity for us to think about how we can engage in a different way and engage different actors. As I mentioned earlier on before, you have two warring parties that clearly believe that they will win this war. So we have to be clear in defining what the end game could look like for these two individuals involved. I think going back to other points that have been made by the other panelists too as well, as we think about our peace processes, ensuring that there's a space as well for these middle powers, some of them that might be involved on both sides in fueling the war, making sure that they are also at the table in some of these conversations because they need to be part of the discussion in finding a resolution to the crisis. And I think finally for me, in terms of a positive takeaway, we've seen citizens and civilians, Sudanese civilians, both those in the country and those in the diaspora, engage in many creative ways. We have to figure out and think about ways to continue supporting Sudanese civilians to tell the story, to tell their own story. And I think there's a space for us to do that. There are opportunities to do this. We see young Sudanese who are organizing themselves within the creative industries outside of your traditional civil society organizations. How do we get these voices? How do we bring them to the forefront to be able to continue to tell these stories? And I do want to encourage everyone to pick up copies of the policy briefs that are outside because they actually outline clear recommendations that are coming from Sudanese civilians as they look at the root causes of the conflict and also proposing recommendations to try to address them.
Thank you. Miada and then El Sadiq and then Cameron. One minute or less. What your key takeaway and the message on Mandela's Day?
Yeah, I think my key takeaway for the audience, I just want to emphasize, really that the situation is it's much worse than it has been perceived. There are 10 million, maybe more, that have been displaced since the crisis began. And of those 10 million are members of my own family. Currently, this is the largest displaced population in the world. Schools, hospitals have been destroyed. People are really suffering from hunger, dehydration. People are just really afraid. It's been a year and a half and we still see no change or hope for an end to this. And so I really just urge our attendees, the international community and concerned individuals to continue supporting our efforts to bring humanitarian assistance to Sudan, donate if you can, advocate for peace and stability in the region, and to put pressure on our governments as well. We cannot stop the funding or the export of weapons to Sudan from external foreign powers unless, we put pressure on our governments. So yeah, please just keep eyes on Sudan and continue to center us. And especially on this day as on Nelson Mandela Day, let's remember to keep talking about Sudan. Let's keep advocating for justice and equality in all corners of the world. I think that each of us really plays a role in making the world a better place.
Thank you. Very brief. El Sadiq, your final point, less than 1 minute.
Yes. Okay, my final point, I think I just call for the UN agencies, international agencies, and international community to have to advocate for having safe routes immediately to allow all NGOs and UN agencies to reach those who are stranded, especially in Khartoum. Some people are starving, and people in Darfur and Kordofan. This is the first step, and then I'm calling for also international community and for the African Union and others to be involved more in ending this war, because Sudanese are suffering a lot. And many people now, they have chosen now even to go to the areas of conflict rather than just to be like a burden to other people in other safe places. This is a situation where we have seen many very rich people now, they have become poor, even they may beg. Everyone lost his property, or everyone has been hurt in a way or another. People, they just want to go back. So we are just calling for peace. We need peace. And the international community should provide support to all these people for resilience and recovery. Thanks.
Thank you. Cameron, your final word.
Well, I think it's been said by a number of people already, but I will just echo something that I was told yesterday by a Sudanese friend who said, I'm so tired of being asked to take a side between the RSF and the SAF. I think we are all, Sudanese and non-Sudanese, being lobbied to take a side in this fight. And I think nobody wants to be on the side of the warring parties. And so we need to be focusing much more on a third way, on creating the necessary civilian coalition. Obviously, we need to talk to the parties who are doing the fighting and get them to stop. But we need to be thinking about giving more hope to Sudanese people and more interlocutors for the international community to engage with. And I think we haven't talked about it, but there is a real division within the Sudanese community about what side they are on. Do they trust the politicians? Do they trust the Takadam committee? Do they trust the FFC? You know, there's real division right now. And I think that's one of the problems that we in the international community face in trying to bring about a solution inside Sudan, is that there's enormous division within the country between the political class and the warring parties. And so I think we need to be focused. There needs to be a track where we focus on building coalitions within Sudan, bridging the divides within the community, and trying to lead politically out of this. And until we do that, I think the warring sides are going to face no pressure, no domestic political pressure to stop fighting.
Thank you. And to our audience in person, we want to thank you. We normally give the floor for a few questions before we close, but today we're not, because we have another big event coming and we are out of time. So apologies for that. And to our online audience, again, that's the same thing. We usually take questions, but not today. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank our audience and our panelists, speakers who are joining us virtually and in person. Before we close, let's go back to the word of Nelson Mandela. Those who live in exile as refugees have for long been sustained by their hope for an end to the conflict and the dawning of a better future. That's Nelson Mandela. So despite all this situation, we hope for a better future for the displaced people inside Sudan, and those outside can do their job to raise the visibility about the fellow human beings that are in this situation. And today's event is bringing that discussion, constructive dialogue, so that policymakers, all the actors, can think about ways to stop this and bring people back to their normal life. With that, let's clap together to thank our panelists. And thank you for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.